What do you think, comrades? Huh? I got a little inspired, but enough said. Let's dive into this video. If there is one thing that I want you to remember, comrades, it's this. Markets are our friend. Capitalism is not. Markets, under the supervision and regulation of a disciplined communist party, can effectively generate the necessary productive forces for a socialist country.
Productive forces, socialism, communism, and what's this about a dictatorship?
Comrades, I wish it would be as simple as to just flash the definition for socialism with Chinese characteristics on screen right now and just be done with the video. But there is just so much we need to learn from China, especially considering its history and economic might it enjoys today. It is incredibly important to understand socialism in China for all leftists around the world, even those that disagree with them. I read this entire book, front to back, ever since I got it. This was a publication from one of the most astute professors of Marxism in China, and it was approved by the CPC themselves. Why did I do this? Because I wanted to hunker down a true definition of what socialism with Chinese characteristics is, dialectically, for you, comrades. This textbook was published back in 2017 in English. However, its original copyright states that this was published back in 2011 under President Hu Jintao, right before Xi Jinping. So take that into account as well. Also, I am unfortunately not a professor or an academic expert in Marxism. Sure, I dedicated large amounts of time reading Marxist theory and publishing dozens of essays about communism in China, but I do not have any certificates or degrees on the subject. So, if I misinterpret or get something 100% completely wrong in good faith by a Marxist-Leninist, please comment below or let me know on my Twitter or Reddit, and I'll be happy to address them, possibly in a second video. With all this said, I'm going to structure this video in very simple terms, going in depth into some areas while speed running other areas. We can literally spend hours on each topic I'm gonna go over here, but I want to explain socialism with Chinese characteristics in 30 minutes or less, starting now. You cannot understand socialism with Chinese characteristics without understanding the following 9 terms: dialectical materialism, historical materialism, productive forces, relations of production, capitalism, communism, socialism, scientific socialism, and 9, the dictatorship of the proletariat. When it comes to the first 2 definitions, Comrade Luna Oi did a fantastic job in diving into these definitions and basically summarized the first chapter or 2 from this textbook in her video here. However, as she took over 40 minutes on these topics, I'm going to spend about 30 seconds using her definitions. So here we go. Dialectics is trying to find the truth by arguing different sides. Materialism is the approach that it is possible to measure, observe, and understand everything in our physical world through scientific methods. Marx and Engels refined them both to create dialectical materialism, which is the understanding of the world by forming arguments based on evidence from our material realities using scientific methods. Historical materialism is simply dialectical materialism being applied to history. History evolves through circumstances of which people pursue such changes, and that momentous shifts in history are interconnected with material conditions of the people at that time, either politically, socially, economically, what have you. It's not done by a singular leader or idea. Moving on to production, production is basically how we as a people produce the things that we need. Productive forces are the methods and tools we use to produce material goods. This ranges from a miner using a pickaxe to mine ore, to factory workers using machines to refine that ore into gold. Relations of production is how a society organizes and manages people and production, aka how labor is used, who benefits from what production, who owns what, etc. Understanding production is incredibly important for Marxism because it shows how we make the stuff we need to survive and who benefits from that creation. Marxism claims that those that have power over how this stuff is made, as well as the process of efficiently obtaining these materials we need to survive, does not necessitate exploitation. From here, we can define capitalism as a social system based on private ownership of the means of production and the exploitation of hired labor. Communism is a stateless, classless, moneyless society. In fact, communism can be summarized in one sentence according to the Communist Manifesto: the abolition of private property. Socialism is the transitional period between the overthrow of capitalism and communism, in which the means of production are publicly owned by the people under the dictatorship of the proletariat. Scientific socialism, as opposed to utopian socialism, uses dialectical and historical materialism to analyze the contradictions of production and value under capitalism and arrives to the inevitable conclusion that socialism will win. However, Marx said that his theory is not dogma or worship, but just a method of observation. The application of Marxist theory must depend on specific times, places, and conditions. But the key words I hope everyone understands about socialism is transition and circumstances. Even Engels said private property cannot be abolished by one stroke. He says, quote, "In all probability, the proletariat revolution will transform existing society gradually and will become able to abolish private property only when the means of production are available in sufficient quantity." Marx concluded, and current socialist countries have proven that societies are able to skip over capitalist modes of production and political systems, but they cannot skip over the high development of productivity associated with capitalism to provide for their people and fend off reactionaries. Marx also observed that the working class cannot simply lay hold of ready-made machinery and wield it for its own purposes. The failure of the Paris Commune, according to Marx, was due to a lack of centralization and authority. This is where the dictatorship of the proletariat comes in, which is the governing power representing the proletariat through the state after the overthrow of capitalism that oversees the transition of socialism by managing the means of production through promoting public ownership and generating productive forces while stamping out reactionaries and capitalistic influences. The importance of understanding all these definitions gives us the conclusion that capitalism and the bourgeois class it creates are exploitative of the people. However, changing the ownership of production to the hands of the people while efficiently providing for the people the material resources they need to survive without exploitation is what scientific socialism is all about, and what socialism with Chinese characteristics attempts to achieve. Once we understand these definitions, we can now turn to Lenin, Stalin, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR. This is extremely important to understand for socialism with Chinese characteristics, as the USSR was the first country in the world to overthrow capitalism and provide a framework to practice socialism. Vladimir Lenin, a hallmark figure of the Russian Revolution, contributed so much to understanding the roles of the state, party, and revolution. By the way, read State and Revolution. He states as quoted, "In any socialist revolution, after the proletariat seizes power and basically finishes the task of depriving exploitators and suppressing their revolt, it is bound to give the priority to the fundamental task of creating a social structure higher than that of the capitalist and improving labor productivity. However, this could not be done through communes, federations, or even jumping into communistic policies, as the productive forces in Russia were nowhere near what they needed to be to efficiently provide for the people while fending off counter-revolutionaries that were coming at them in droves. This is where we get to New Economic Policy, or NEPT. NEPT was basically state capitalistic measures taken to increase the productive forces of Russia during their transition from capitalism to socialism. The theoretical significance of NEPT is that it provides an economic model for countries dominated by small class production to transition into socialism. Thought to be a retreat, many of the left criticize this. But as we see how important production is for a stable socialist system, Lenin pushed for NEPT by stating the following: state capitalism would be a step forward as compared with the present state of affairs in our Soviet Republic. I can imagine what noble indignation some people will recoil from these words. What? The transition of state capitalism in the Soviet socialist republics would be a step forward? Isn't this a betrayal of socialism? We must deal with this point in greater detail. Lenin continues, our state capitalism differs essentially from the state capitalism in countries that have bourgeois governments, in that the state with us is represented not by the bourgeoisie, but by the proletariats who have succeeded in winning the full confidence of the peasantry. On the contrary, the development of capitalism controlled and regulated by the proletariat state, i.e. state capitalism in this sense of the term, is advantageous and necessary in an extremely devastated and backward small peasant country. After the economy recovered through NEPT, Stalin took power and initiated his model for the economy, which include, number one, a highly centralized planned economy through governmental and political means, two, collectivized farming, and three, the banning of private and commercial industries. By the time the Stalin model was installed, the USSR was the most powerful country in Europe and the second most powerful country in the world in less than 2 decades. This Stalin model for socialist economies became the main planned economy model for building socialism. However, after World War II and Stalin's death, there were difficult economic periods of stagnation and constant reform to keep up productivity, along with the liberalization efforts and de-Stalinization efforts from Soviet leaders. And as China soon found out, an unyielding adherence to the Stalin model was not working out for them. Before I get into this chapter, I want to say this Marx quote as it perfectly summarizes China's conditions and pathways towards socialism with Chinese characteristics. Marx said, quote, "No social order is ever destroyed before all the productive forces for which it is sufficient have been developed, and new superior relations of production never replace older ones before the material conditions for their existence have matured within the framework of the old society. So long as it is not possible to produce so much that there is enough for all, with more left over for expanding social capital and extending the forces of production, there must always be a ruling class directing the use of society's productive forces and a poor oppressed class." Jumping into Mao now. Mao was a great revolutionary leader that broke many precedents with Marxist theory set by the USSR while following Marxist-Leninist ideology for China to arrive at the success it is today. He unified the necessary classes and nationalistic interests in overthrowing capitalism. He commenced an industrialization process under his New Democracy initiatives to transition into socialism, and finally he pursued Marxism in every step in addressing China's social, economic, and political issues. It is because of his revolutionary achievements that the CPC continues to uphold Mao Zedong thought, and many members of the CPC consider themselves Maoists. However, there were some serious drawbacks that some of Mao's initiatives had, some of which are considered, quote, mistakes by the CPC. The textbook doesn't really go into these mistakes, but they do label them as such. By following more centralized models of the USSR while neglecting economic development to prepare for a war with other capitalist powers that never came to be, the economy stagnated, with incremental increases in GDP and productivity. Things like the Great Leap Forward, Cultural Revolution, and the Gang of Four fiasco were all signs that an overcommitment to socialistic ideals, while the productive forces were nowhere near ready for such transitions due to their material conditions, were damaging the people. I want to add here as well why China's commitment to scientific socialism is incredible. They were able to analyze their material realities of their situation. By the 1980s, productive forces were not maximized as they had a population of over 900 million people, 80% of which were still peasants. They were able to critique their own founder and call out these mistakes. They were not dogmatically or arbitrarily following Mao while ignoring their material conditions. They adopted and still upheld the thoughts and contributions of Mao while shifting towards a better transitional system. Deng Xiaoping said it best when he said, quote, "It's true that Mao made mistakes in a certain period, but he was after all a principal founder of the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Republic of China. In evaluating his merits and mistakes, we hold that his mistakes were only secondary. What he did for the Chinese people can never be erased. In our hearts, we Chinese will always cherish him as the founder of our party and our state." China's conditions were different from that of the Soviet Union and needed to blaze a new path forward in order to survive. A shift in focus to China's productive forces and economic development was needed, which leads us into Deng Xiaoping stated, "The essence of socialism is liberation and development of productive forces, elimination of exploitation and polarization, and the ultimate achievement for prosperity for all." The first step in moving towards their famous opening up and reform was admitting that they are still in the primary stages of socialism and will remain there for a long time. Productivity was not high enough to usher in a transition towards socialism. They must keep building their productive forces through more investment within and outside the country. With the need for China to dramatically increase its productive forces, the CPC and Deng Xiaoping were going against the Stalin model of planned economies to address their own conditions for the first time and discovering that one of the tools that can help them rapidly produce their productive forces was markets. The establishment of the socialist market economy in China is a breakthrough in traditional socialist theory and a subversion in modern Western economics that equated markets with capitalism. Here is the textbook definition of what a market economy is. A market economy is an economic system in which prices, salary, and the supply of goods are controlled by what and how much people buy, not by the government, applied in both private-owned capitalist economy and a public-owned socialist economy. Price is set by producers of consumers and the owners of the means of production, and a market economy is subordinate to the basic social system that can serve both capitalism and socialism. Both the Anglo-Saxon or the United States and UK model and the Rhine model, the European markets, limit state intervention, emphasize individualism, and relies on a capitalistic foundations for their markets to function. China's socialist market model emphasizes the following. 1. The market is subordinate, restricted, and dependent on the basic socialist system. 2. Dominance of public ownership, which still holds true today in China. 3. The principle of distribution according to work. And 4. the promotion of the goal of common prosperity, and that people are masters of their country. This is different from capitalist market economies, which maximizes profit along with exploiting labor power to the maximum possible extent, inevitably maximizing the polarization between rich and poor. We're obviously seeing that today, folks. Also within private ownership of the means of production, the capitalist system is safeguarding the interests of the bourgeoisie. The working class, without the means of production, has to engage in wage labor subject to exploitation and oppression. The socialist system establishes an equal status of the working people as masters of their country. A socialist market is based on public ownership of the means of production, which makes common prosperity as the main objective. In a socialist market economy, the purpose of production is to meet the ever-growing material and cultural needs of the people, rather than for profit. This model gave Deng Xiaoping the confidence to say the following: no matter what degree we open up to the outside world and admit foreign capital, its relative magnitude will be small and cannot affect our system of socialist public ownership of the means of production. Absorbing foreign capital and technology, and even allowing foreigners to construct plants in China, can only play a complementary role in our effort to develop the productive forces in a socialist society. Of course, this will bring some decadent capitalist influences into China, and we are aware of this possibility. It is nothing to be afraid of. Why in the world is China not afraid of capitalist influences that the market may bring? Because of the dictatorship of the proletariat, or in China, the people's democratic dictatorship. Market economies are opposite of common prosperity and are more akin to serving individual private interests. However, the CPC's duty is to redistribute wealth to narrow such gap and eliminate contradictions through taxation, social relief, security policies, and other measures to ensure the well-being of workers and achieve common prosperity. But they must do more than this as well. Markets promote other ideologies that harm and corrode Marxism. Bourgeois liberalism, money worship, economic privatization, neoliberalism. Through the CPC's leadership, all these paper tigers were defeated, especially considering the 2008 financial crisis and the corona pandemic. How can the CPC be so ideologically disciplined? Deng Xiaoping's 4 cardinal principles. The principle of upholding the socialist path, the principle of upholding the people's democratic dictatorship, the principle of upholding the leadership of the Communist Party of China, and the principle of upholding Mao Zedong thought and Marxist-Leninism. These are the non-debatable tenets of socialism with Chinese characteristics. Reflecting on scientific socialism, these principles were a must to combat the influences markets had against communism and use them to build up the productive forces and wealth to transition into a more advanced socialism. I highly recommend everybody read the CPC Constitution and its commitment in upholding Marxism-Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, Deng Xiaoping theory, the 3 represents, the scientific outlook on development, and of course, Xi Jinping thought. All of this lies a definition of what socialism with Chinese characteristics is. All right, here we go. Socialism with Chinese characteristics is a science for the systematic study and application of nature and law of the socialist construction of China. Marxism applied to China. It is an ever-evolving and living, breathing doctrine that is still being applied today. And I'm gonna be honest here, comrades. At first, it was difficult for me to accept this very broad and general definition. Doesn't this apply to all communist countries? But after seeing the challenges China pursued against the Soviet model, their historical conditions, and even the founder of their country, it all came together that using the Marxist tools of dialectical and historical materialism to understand the importance of productive forces to provide for their people, as well as generating enough resources for a proper socialist transition with the discipline of the people's democratic dictatorship, this all made sense. This is not some religious ideology where zealotry and commitment is rewarded with prosperity. This, comrades, is scientific planning. All the prosperity we see in China today is carefully articulated socialism. Socialism with Chinese characteristics has a specific meaning as well. It is not applicable to all other countries that are building socialism like Cuba, the DPRK, Laos, or Vietnam. From the textbook, the goal of socialism with Chinese characteristics is taking the path of socialism under the leadership of the CPC, and in light of China's basic conditions, take economic development as the central task. Adhere to the 4 cardinal principles: preserve, reform, and opening up policy, release and develop the productive forces, consolidate and improve the socialist system, develop a socialist market economy, socialist democracy, an advanced socialist culture, and a harmonious socialist society, and make China a prosperous, strong, democratic, culturally advanced, and harmonious modern socialist country. Now, with all of this said, hopefully this creates a better understanding of the following. Absolutely not. Socialism with Chinese characteristics and Deng Xiaoping theory shows an unrelenting commitment to Marxism-Leninism. Although markets are used to generate productive forces and are akin to capitalist inclinations, the role of the CPC quickly shuts down any growing capitalist influences, and to even have that role under the dictatorship of the proletariat shows the significance of scientific socialism applied to Chinese conditions. It would have been easy for the Chinese government to just cast communism aside when opening up. Why commit to Marxism-Leninism for so long when the markets appear to be working? Let the capitalist influences infiltrate our system. Hell, they did in fact have those debates. But look at them now. In less than 1 generation, they went from an agrarian society with 80% peasants to an economic powerhouse that towers the West, especially considering their public sector remaining dominant and diverse sectors of the economy developing by them, and it is all due to Marxism-Leninism, not capitalism. Mind you, billionaires only make up a very small fraction of the party. But this textbook actually does go into this and addresses this head on. According to the book, politics is the concentrated expression of the economy. The accumulation of economic interest is bound to lead to political engagement, and economic interest groups will inevitably enter the political sphere to express, strive for, and defend their own rights and interests. This is truly scientific that they would even admit this, and private enterprise owners are no exception to that. Rather than suppressing or ignoring this contradiction, which breeds corruption and dangerous hostile capitalistic influences within China, the CPC acknowledges this and embraces the reality that people have economic interests. However, rather than allowing them to have a free-for-all where they have the ability to influence members with money and success, they must go through the same tests and rigors of joining the CPC and respecting the ideology. From the textbook again, we quote, "Socialist politics with Chinese characteristics does not exclude political participation by private enterprise owners, as long as they follow the basic principles of leadership of the CPC, people as the masters of the country, and rule of law. Therefore, the ruling party should allow private enterprise owners to participate in politics within the framework of the system with Chinese characteristics and grant them full expression of their economic needs and political will. But of course, their political participation should be conducive rather than detrimental to safeguard the purity and vanguard nature of the ruling party and the healthy development of socialist modernization with Chinese characteristics." Recently, we saw a rich, wealthy billionaire expelled from the party for his negative critiques of the four cardinal principles and faces prosecution for corruption. Additionally, China puts to death so many bankers for corruption as well. The CPC does not place any capitalist or billionaire ahead of the Politburo.
China is a market economy, and it's a vibrant market economy, but it is not a capitalist country. Here's why. There's no way a group of billionaires could control the Politburo, as billionaires control American policymaking.
Billionaires, like markets, are beholden to the socialist system, as they are subordinate, restricted, and dependent upon the basic socialist system, as reflected in Lenin's Tax in Kind, where he talks about NEP. He says, quote, "The concessionaires is a capitalist. He conducts his business on capitalist lines for profit and is willing to enter into an agreement with the proletariat government in order to obtain super profits or raw materials which he cannot otherwise obtain or can obtain with great difficulty. As China builds the capacity to redistribute wealth, to lift 800 million out of poverty by alleviation commissions, job placement programs, and free housing through its market economy. Having billionaires to generate such wealth for 1.4 billion people is unsurprising. The CPC monitors and accepts them into their party, not through some corrupted means of capitalist power, but to curb and restrict their influences to ensure its promotion of socialism. With this, huge efforts in stamping out corruptions have been taking place in China. There have been over 1 million corruption cases since 2016, with these cases doubling over the past year. Communists can definitely say that there is no tolerance for corruption under Xi Jinping. With all this said, comrades, I really hope this gives you a clear understanding of socialism with Chinese characteristics. I want to end this video with one final quote from Deng Xiaoping. Our reform is an experiment, not only for China, but also the rest of the world. We believe the experiment will succeed. If it does, our experience may be useful to the cause of world socialism and other developing countries. If we assume by mid-21st century our population will have reached 1.5 billion, and that we shall have a per capita GDP of $4,000, then our total annual GDP will be $6 trillion and will place China in the front ranks of the world. When we reach that goal, we shall not only have blazed a new path for the peoples of the third world, who represent a quarter of the world's population, but also, and this is even more important, shall have demonstrated to mankind that socialism is the only path forward and that it is superior to capitalism.